The Montana sky, a vast pale blue, stretched endlessly above the towering pines. It was early autumn, and the air held a crisp bite, carrying the earthy scent of damp needles and distant wood smoke. Silas, a man carved from the very land he worked, lifted his double-bladed axe, the heavy steel glinting in a sliver of sunlight that pierced the dense canopy. His worn leather suspenders creaked with the effort as he brought the tool down, a powerful rhythmic thud reverberating through the hushed forest. Splinters flew, catching the light like golden dust, and the trunk of the ponderosa pine groaned before finally yielding. Silas lived by the axe, his life a relentless cycle of felling, limbing, and hauling. Each swing was a testament to his sheer physical endurance, but also to a profound, almost desperate need for isolation. His cabin, a rough-hewn structure of logs and mud chinking, sat deep in a valley, a forgotten speck on the edge of civilization. He rarely saw another soul, and he preferred it that way. The quiet was a balm, a shield against the ghosts that haunted his waking hours. His face, etched with deep lines around eyes the color of cold river stones, bore the weight of unseen sorrows. He was a man who had loved and lost, and in losing, had shed his faith like a worn-out coat. God, he believed, had long since abandoned this unforgiving land, and him along with it. He ate simple meals of smoked meat and hardtack by the glow of a sputtering oil lamp, the only sound the crackle of the hearth fire or the distant howl of a wolf. The loneliness was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he wore, but it was a loneliness he had chosen. It was safer than connection, less painful than hope. He found a peculiar comfort in the predictable harshness of his days, the raw, undeniable reality of his labor. Each felled tree was a small victory against the vast wilderness and a small distraction from the emptiness within. The wind, a mournful whisper through the pines, seemed to mirror the quiet sorrow that had become his oldest friend. The rhythmic thwack of Silas's axe was suddenly, violently shattered. A piercing shriek, raw and unmistakably human, tore through the quiet woods. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound that ripped through the carefully constructed walls around his heart, the desperate wail of a baby. His muscles seized, the axe frozen mid-swing. A jolt, sharp and unwelcome, shot through him, mingling with a familiar pang of gut-wrenching grief. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tight. "Ignore it," a voice urged within him, harsh and insistent. "It's not your concern. Don't go there again." But the cry came again, a fragile, trembling sound that tugged at something deep and buried. It was an impossible sound in this desolate place. Reluctantly, his heavy boots crushing pine needles and fallen leaves, Silas moved towards the sound, his senses on high alert. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic scent of an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled, a low growl in the distance, and the wind began to whip through the trees, making them sway and groan. He pushed through a dense thicket of huckleberry bushes, their branches scratching at his worn canvas jacket. And then he saw her. Huddled at the base of an enormous ancient redwood, its roots gnarled like the hands of time, was a young woman. She looked no older than 20, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was thin, her clothes torn and mud-stained, and she clutched a small bundled form tightly to her chest. The baby, a tiny red-faced infant, let out another fragile cry, its small mouth a perfect O of distress. Ilara, as he would later learn, was clearly terrified, her wide, haunted eyes darting frantically, not at him, but at the shadows behind him, as if expecting something terrible to emerge from the deepening gloom of the forest. Beside her lay a meager, tattered satchel, a few scraps of cloth, and a tarnished silver locket spilling from its open flap. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly on the leaves around them, mirroring the tears that now freely streamed down Ilara's face. Silas stood for a long moment, the rain beginning to dampen his hair and shoulders. The raw desperation in Ilara's eyes, the defenselessness of the tiny baby, chipped away at his resolve. He wasn't a hero, hadn't been one in a long time, but he couldn't leave them to the mercy of the elements, or whatever nightmare had driven them here. He gestured with his axe towards his cabin, a silent invitation. My place. Not far. The walk back was fraught with a tense silence, broken only by the baby's occasional whimper and the increasing drumming of rain on the forest floor. Ilara kept her head down, her movements skittish, like a wild deer. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and still, smelling faintly of pine resin and old wood smoke. It was a simple space. A rough-hewn table, 2 stools, a cot in the corner covered with a thick wool blanket, and a stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly. Silas poked the fire, coaxing flames to life, their warmth a welcome embrace against the sudden chill. He found a piece of hardened beef jerky and a tin mug, filling it with water from a bucket by the door. Ilara devoured the jerky, her hands trembling, her eyes never leaving the baby. She held the infant with a fierce, almost desperate protectiveness. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. Silas simply nodded, watching her with a quiet intensity. He saw the weariness in her shoulders, the dark circles beneath her eyes, and a fragile strength that defied her youth. When he asked her name, she gave it hesitantly, Ilara. But when he pressed gently about why she was out here, alone with a newborn, her gaze darted away. "Trouble," she whispered, her fingers tracing the faint lines of a distinctive tattoo on her wrist, a series of intricately intertwined knots. "Bad trouble." She offered no more, her lips pressing into a thin line. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and untold dangers. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling around the cabin like a hungry beast, rattling the single window pane, mirroring the wild uncertainty that now filled Silas's once predictable world. He felt an inexplicable pull, a fragile thread connecting him to this desperate young woman and her silent, vulnerable cargo. Days bled into a tense, uneasy rhythm. Silas continued his solitary work, but now his senses were heightened, constantly scanning the woods, listening for any sound that wasn't the wind or the rustle of leaves. Ilara, though still guarded, began to move more freely within the small cabin. She cared for the baby with a quiet devotion, humming lullabies that were barely audible above the crackle of the fire. The baby, no longer a source of irritation for Silas, began to exert a strange, softening influence. He'd catch himself watching the tiny face, the miniature fingers grasping at the air, and a long dormant ache would stir in his chest. He remembered another small hand, another innocent gaze, memories he'd painstakingly buried beneath years of solitude and hardened resolve. A painful image flashed in his mind, a small wooden cradle empty, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the western ridges, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. A sound reached Silas that made his blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely a whisper on the wind, but unmistakable, the distant rhythmic pounding of hooves, not one horse, but several. Ilara, who had been rocking the baby by the hearth, froze. Her face went deathly pale, and she clutched the infant tighter, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "They found me," she breathed, her voice a raw, choked whisper. "They found us." The sound grew louder, closer, the distinct thud-thud-thud of horses galloping across rough terrain. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of silence, felt suddenly fragile, exposed. He looked at Ilara, truly saw the raw, desperate fear in her eyes, and then at the tiny, innocent bundle in her arms. The weight of his own past failures, of times he hadn't been strong enough, hadn't been quick enough, surged through him with a chilling force. He had promised himself he would never care again, never open himself to that kind of pain. But looking at them, at their vulnerability, something shifted deep within him. It was a chance, perhaps, to right a wrong, to finally stand and protect what was innocent, what was threatened. The cold, logical part of him screamed at the folly, at the danger, but a deeper, more primal instinct, long suppressed, took hold. The decision, born of a rediscovered compassion and a burning need for redemption, was made. He would not run, he would stand. He moved to the cabin door, his hand instinctively reaching for the axe, its familiar weight a grim comfort. The first rider burst through the tree line, a dark silhouette against the dying light, followed quickly by 3 others. They were lean, hard men, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, their movements quick and predatory. Leading them was a man named Elias, his eyes glinting with a cold, almost fanatical determination. "Elara!" he bellowed, his voice raw, laced with fury. "Give us the child. It's rightfully ours." Elara, clutching the baby, stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady despite her trembling hands. "He's not yours, Elias. He's my son, and you'll never have him." Silas, standing sentinel at the cabin door, his axe gripped tight, knew this was it. He was no longer just a lumberjack, he was a guardian. The air crackled with tension, thick with the scent of pine and gunpowder. The confrontation erupted with brutal swiftness. Elias's men dismounted, drawing their pistols. Silas moved with a surprising agility for a man his size, his axe a terrifying blur. He parried a blow, then swung, his aim true, sending one man sprawling. The fight was a desperate, chaotic dance of survival, grunts and shouts echoing through the deepening twilight. A bullet grazed Silas's arm, a searing pain, but he barely registered it. His focus was solely on protecting Elara and the child. In a brief lull, as Silas wrestled with one of Elias's men, Elara, desperate to save them, finally cried out the truth, her voice ragged with emotion. "He wants him for the gold, Silas, not because he's family. My mother hid it, buried it on the old homestead. Elias found out, but he can't get to it without the child, without a rightful claim to the land." She revealed that Elias was her estranged father, but the child was her own, conceived with a man Elias despised, a man who also knew the secret of the hidden gold mine on a remote, disputed patch of land her mother had left to her. Her mother, before her death, had entrusted Elara with the child and a key, warning her of Elias's relentless greed. Just as Silas was cornered, a lone horseman appeared from the opposite direction, riding hard. He was an older man, his face weathered but kind, and he rode directly between Silas and Elias's remaining men. "Elias, you're a fool!" he bellowed. It was Jebediah, a prospector who had known Elara's mother. He recognized the distinct pattern on Elara's tarnished locket, a family heirloom, and the unique knots on her wrist tattoo, symbols of a trust placed in Elara by her mother. Jebediah had been searching for Elara and the baby, tasked by Elara's dying mother to ensure their safety and rightful claim. He corroborated Elara's story, revealing Elias's true, avaricious motives to his remaining men, who exchanged uneasy glances. Faced with exposure and unexpected resistance, his plans shattered. Elias, his face a mask of rage, cursed them all, and along with his 2 remaining loyalists, reluctantly retreated into the darkening woods. As the dust settled, the echoes of the conflict faded. Silas leaned against the cabin doorframe, his wounded arm throbbing, but a profound sense of calm settled over him. He had faced his past, not by running, but by standing firm, by choosing to protect the innocent. The emptiness that had gnawed at him for years began to recede, replaced by a fragile but undeniable warmth. He looked at Elara, no longer a stranger, but a fellow survivor, a person to whom he was now inextricably linked. She met his gaze, her eyes brimming with a gratitude that transcended words. The baby, now awake and quietly observing them, gurgled softly in her arms, a tiny, vibrant spark of new life. The last ember of Silas's faith, long thought extinguished by sorrow and isolation, glowed once more, rekindled by the light of a child's innocent gaze and the enduring, unexpected power of human connection. The future in this wild, beautiful land was still uncertain, fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a very long time, Silas felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that he was no longer truly alone. The vast, empty wilderness no longer felt so desolate. It now held the quiet promise of a future, shared and redefined by the bonds forged in desperation and rediscovered compassion.